Hi everyone. It's week 7. We've got 3 weeks, and we're going to work through the second letter to the Thessalonians. It's a very short book, but like all scripture, it contains teachings and truths which we can use to sharpen our own understanding of theology, and kind of each writing on a topic gives us another facet to understand God's will for that issue. And so the Thessalonians had sort of 2 issues. Paul's writing the second letter after a period. He writes 1 Thessalonians. There's a period of time. He receives more news from the Thessalonian church. He's still in Corinth. He writes a second letter back. So there's been a period of time. They've dealt with some issues, but 2 big ones come up in this letter. One is further questions about end times. The second is, there's a lot going on in this room. I've got Will assisting with the videography today. The second issue is idleness in the community, possibly connected to the sense that, well, the world's going to end, and so what's the point in working? So, in this book, Paul covers the full arc of sanctification around final judgment. Now, when we read these passages today, they are incredibly jarring. I think for a community, maybe we know that there's persecution in India at the moment, in many other places, I'm sure. For a community that's in intense persecution, reading these verses may give a real sense of relief that enemies of God will ultimately be punished. I think for us today in Australia, we read these and it probably just feels a bit uncomfortable, actually. Our culture is happy with a Christianity that is at most maybe a sort of moral guideline. But it's really not interested in a Christianity that talks about absolute truth and final judgment based on that. And we're kidding ourselves if we don't recognize that we, even as Christians, are being molded and shaped. Those kind of pointy edges of faith are being sanded down by culture, because things like absolute truth are not welcome in the world we live in today. And so as we work through books, the reason we work through books is because we come across passages that are a bit uncomfortable to think about, but it's important that we do. So we're going to work through what Paul says about, ultimate judgment. The second thing I've been thinking about as we go through these passages in Thessalonians is this idea that the gospel has been under fire since the beginning. We might at times be led to believe that today, progressive thought has refined and advanced in such a way that it's now challenging scripture in a way that it hasn't before. And in reality, there has always been ideologies and philosophy that has challenged scripture. The Thessalonians were being challenged by the kind of Greco-Roman understanding of end times and judgment and the role of the gods. So that was their issue. They were being challenged by the sort of conventional thought of the day. 2023 in Australia, we're being challenged on different things, different fronts, but the idea that our faith has always been at odds with prevailing thought is not a new thing, and we shouldn't ever be allow ourselves to feel like, modern thought has caught up and now surpassed our faith. No, it's always been the case that faith has been challenged. Paul's advice to the Thessalonians is the same thing he'd probably say to us today, and that is that we need to continue to recognize God's grace in our lives, that we rely on God's power for our faithfulness and fruitfulness in life, that we should examine the life and teachings of Christ and those who've gone before us, and we shouldn't let ideas from outside of that dethrone God in our lives. And so we have scripture, situation, culture has changed a bit, obviously, over the centuries, but we still have the same scripture. We still have the example of Christ to follow, and that's why we are reading these books. And yeah, I look forward to going through these last couple of weeks with you in Thessalonians, and look forward to chatting on Thursday. I'll see you then. Okay, Will, do you want to push the stop button?